Walk through the quiet back halls of any major museum, and you'll find rows of skulls that never make it into glass displays. They sit in drawers, wrapped in archival paper, labeled with catalog numbers instead of stories. At first glance, they look human. The familiar curve of the cranium, the hollow eye sockets, the jawline where flesh once clung. But then you notice something that doesn't belong. Small openings where there should be solid bone, additional cavities that don't match any known muscle attachment, blood vessel route, or sinus chamber. These are not cracks from damage. They are not holes drilled by ritual. They are symmetrical, clean, and grown into the bone itself. And once you see one, you can't unsee it. Anthropologists often use the word variation to explain uncomfortable anomalies. Human skulls vary, they say. Deformities happen, pathologies exist. But deformities leave signatures. Disease eats bone unevenly. Trauma fractures it irregularly. Ritual modification leaves tool marks. These skulls show none of that. The bone around the cavities is smooth, reinforced, remodeled over time, as if the skull grew that way from birth. Whatever passed through those openings was meant to be there. Whatever function they served, the body adapted to them over a lifetime. Some skulls show extra cavities behind the eye sockets, deeper than the sinuses and positioned too precisely to be random. Others display paired openings along the parietal bones, not aligned with known emissary veins. In several cases, the internal architecture of the skull reveals channels leading inward, not outward, suggesting pathways rather than damage. When CT scans were performed on a few of these specimens, researchers noticed something unsettling. The bone density around the cavities was higher than average, reinforced as if to protect something passing through repeatedly. Bone only strengthens in response to stress. Something used those openings. These skulls are rarely discussed in public lectures or textbooks. When they are mentioned, they're dismissed quickly. Rare anomalies, statistical noise, outliers that don't challenge the larger narrative. But the numbers don't fully support that comfort. Similar skulls have been cataloged across different continents, different time periods, and different cultures. They don't cluster in one region or one lineage. They appear in Africa, in parts of Eastern Europe, in Central Asia. Some date back tens of thousands of years. Others are far more recent. The consistency is what raises questions. Nature repeats what works. Errors are chaotic. Design is patterned. If these cavities were not deformities, then what were they for? One hypothesis quietly discussed in academic circles involves vascular structures now absent from modern humans. Additional blood vessels supplying regions of the brain that no longer exist or no longer function the same way. Another theory suggests enhanced sensory input, extra nerve pathways entering the skull, possibly connected to structures that allowed perception beyond what we consider normal. This sounds speculative, even fantastical, until you remember that human evolution is not a straight line. It is a tangled bush of branches, most of which were cut short. For most of the 20th century, human evolution was taught as a simple progression. One species replaces another. One skull shape evolves into the next. But recent discoveries shattered that illusion. We now know that multiple human-like species lived alongside each other for hundreds of thousands of years. They interbred. They competed. They shared landscapes and resources. Some disappeared. Some merged into us. Others may have left traces we don't know how to recognize. Now, imagine a hominin species with a slightly different neurological architecture. Not smarter in a modern sense, but tuned differently. A brain wired for heightened spatial awareness, or altered states of perception, or sensitivity to environmental cues we barely register. Additional cavities in the skull could have housed specialized organs, glands, or nerve clusters that modern humans lost as survival pressures changed. Evolution does not preserve what is no longer necessary. It erases without sentiment. Museum records show that many of these skulls were classified decades ago, before advanced imaging was available. Once labeled as abnormal, they were filed away and rarely revisited. Funding favors discoveries that fit existing frameworks. A skull that suggests a forgotten branch of humanity doesn't just challenge textbooks. It challenges identity. It raises uncomfortable questions about what it means to be human and whether we are the final version or merely the surviving one. There is also an institutional inertia at play. Museums are not neutral vaults of truth. They are shaped by donors, national narratives, and academic reputations. Acknowledging that some bones in storage may not belong to Homo sapiens at all would require reevaluating entire collections. It would mean admitting that we may have misidentified our own ancestors, or worse, that we shared the world with beings close enough to us to be mistaken for human, yet different enough to unsettle our sense of uniqueness. Consider the fact that many ancient cultures spoke of others who looked like humans but were not quite the same. Not monsters, not gods, just different. Stories describe people with strange awareness, unusual abilities, or altered perception. These accounts are often dismissed as myth, but myths frequently preserve truths long after their context is lost. What if those stories were memories of coexistence? What if the skulls with extra cavities are the physical echoes of that forgotten overlap? Modern medicine offers another unsettling angle. Certain rare genetic conditions today result in minor additional foramina, tiny openings in the skull associated with altered nerve routing. These conditions are considered abnormalities because they deviate from the modern human template. But what if the template itself is incomplete? What if these traits were once standard in another human lineage, and what we see now are faint genetic remnants resurfacing by accident? When researchers attempt to model how these skulls developed, the timelines don't match known pathologies. The cavities form early, during growth, not later through damage or disease. The surrounding bone adapts harmoniously. This suggests genetic programming, not accident. And genetics once again points toward lineage. The most disturbing implication is not that these skulls belong to a forgotten species, but that we may have chosen to forget them. Scientific progress is not just about discovery. It is also about selection. Which questions are allowed? Which answers are acceptable? Which anomalies are worth chasing? And which are better left in drawers? If these skulls represent a parallel human form, then extinction was not just a biological event. It was a narrowing of possibility. Traits that did not align with brute survival may have vanished. Subtler forms of perception, different ways of experiencing reality. Evolution favors efficiency, not depth. What survives is not always what sees the most, but what lasts the longest. The silence around these bones is not proof of their insignificance. Often, silence is a defense mechanism. It's easier to call something a deformity than to ask what it once was. Easier to label than to listen. Because listening might reveal that humanity was never singular, that the story of us includes others whose bones still rest in our museums, misnamed, misunderstood, and waiting. And if that is true, then the question is no longer whether these skulls are human. The question becomes more unsettling. What kind of human did we replace, and what did we lose when they disappeared? When museum researchers analyze ancient bones, they expect to find familiar chemical signatures. Calcium phosphate forming hydroxyapatite, trace amounts of magnesium, sodium, and fluorine, slight variations depending on diet, soil conditions, and age. Bone is not mysterious in that sense. It follows rules. That is why certain specimens quietly unsettle the scientists who study them, because some bones do not follow those rules at all. Hidden in museum drawers and research collections are skeletal remains that contain mineral traces not associated with any known human illness, diet, or burial environment. These are not cases of contamination from modern preservatives. They are not residues from soil seepage or groundwater intrusion. The minerals are embedded deep within the bone matrix itself, bonded at the molecular level, as if the body incorporated them while alive. Whatever these individuals were, their bones grew around elements that should not have been there. In several documented cases, spectrographic analysis revealed unusually high concentrations of strontium, barium, and even rare earth elements in ratios that don't match any known human population. Strontium does appear in bones sometimes, but usually as a dietary marker reflecting local geology. These specimens show patterns that don't correspond to any environment where humans are known to have lived. The ratios are too precise, too consistent across different bones of the same skeleton, and sometimes across multiple skeletons found thousands of miles apart. Illness can change bone chemistry, but disease leaves chaos. Cancer, infection, and metabolic disorders distort structure unevenly. These bones are structurally normal, dense, well-formed, strong. The minerals are distributed symmetrically, integrated during growth, not deposited afterward. That alone rules out most known pathological explanations. What makes this even stranger is that some of these mineral signatures suggest exposure levels that would be toxic to modern humans. High concentrations of heavy elements should cause organ failure, neurological damage, or death long before they could be incorporated into bone. Yet the skeletal structure shows no signs of stress, degeneration, or arrested development. These individuals lived long enough for full bone maturation. Their bodies did not treat these minerals as poisons. They treated them as building materials. This forces a deeply uncomfortable question. What if these bones did not belong to Homo sapiens as we understand ourselves today? What if they belonged to a parallel human lineage with a different biochemistry, capable of processing elements our bodies reject? Human evolution is often discussed in terms of shape and size, skull volume, limb proportions, dental patterns, but evolution also operates invisibly at the biochemical level. Enzymes change, cellular transport mechanisms adapt. What a body can absorb, tolerate, or require can shift dramatically over thousands of generations. A slight difference in metabolism can separate species just as clearly as bone structure. Some researchers have proposed that these mineral anomalies point to a population adapted to environments we no longer associate with human habitation. Regions with extreme geochemistry, volcanic zones, areas with high natural radiation or unusual soil composition. But this explanation breaks down when remains from different continents show similar mineral patterns despite vastly different local geology. These individuals were not shaped by their environment alone. Their bodies were prepared for it. There are even cases where isotopic analysis suggests that the mineral ratios in the bones do not match the ratios in the surrounding soil at all. In other words, the environment did not imprint itself onto the bones. The bones imposed their own pattern. That implies internal regulation, not passive absorption. A biological system evolved to maintain those ratios deliberately. Ancient texts and myths rarely describe early humans as fragile. Instead, they speak of beings who could live in harsh places, consume strange foods, and thrive where others could not. These stories are often dismissed as symbolic exaggeration, but what if they were distorted memories of coexistence with a type of human whose biology truly was different? Consider how modern humans react to heavy metals. Even small amounts disrupt neural function. But what if another hominin species had neural shielding, or alternative ion channels, or bone structures designed to sequester potentially harmful elements safely? Bone is one of the body's primary storage sites. It protects vital organs by locking away substances the body doesn't want circulating freely. In these skeletons, the bone appears not to be protecting the body from these minerals, but utilizing them. Some scientists have quietly wondered whether these minerals played a functional role: increased bone density, enhanced durability. Altered electrical conductivity. Bone is not inert. It responds to mechanical stress and electrical signals. Certain minerals can change how bone interacts with energy, vibration, and force. This enters territory that mainstream science approaches cautiously because it blurs the line between biology and physics. There is also the question of why these findings rarely reach public awareness. Scientific papers that mention unusual mineral traces often frame them narrowly, avoiding broader implications. Funding bodies do not reward speculation about lost human species. Museums do not rush to relabel exhibits. Acknowledging that some bones in their care may belong to a forgotten branch of humanity would destabilize established timelines and evolutionary models. It would also raise ethical questions. If these individuals were not fully Homo sapiens, how were they treated? Did they interbreed with us? Were they outcompeted, absorbed, or deliberately erased? Bones do not tell stories of conflict easily, but chemistry can reveal long-term patterns of difference that shape how groups relate. Modern genetic research has already shown that we carry traces of other humans within us. Neanderthal DNA, Denisovan DNA, ghost lineages we cannot yet name. Those discoveries were once considered fringe ideas. Now they are accepted facts. Each time, the story of humanity expanded, became messier, less comfortable. The bones with unknown mineral traces may represent another expansion waiting to happen. The most unsettling possibility is that these mineral patterns reflect not just adaptation, but specialization. A group evolved for conditions or roles that no longer exist. Perhaps environments that vanished after climate shifts. Perhaps niches that modern humans could not fill. Evolution does not preserve redundancy. When a role disappears, so does the form adapted to it. And then there is the silence. These bones sit quietly, cataloged, measured, chemically analyzed, and then filed away. Their data points exist, but their narrative does not. They are treated as curiosities, not clues. But clues do not announce themselves loudly. They wait for someone willing to connect them. If these bones truly belong to a forgotten human species, then their disappearance was not just a biological event. It was a narrowing of what humanity could be. We became more uniform, more chemically constrained, more dependent on stable environments. Perhaps that made us better survivors in the long run, or perhaps it made us blind to possibilities that once existed within our own family tree. Because the deeper question is not why these minerals are there. The deeper question is why our bones no longer carry them, and what kind of human could once grow from elements we now fear. Long before museums existed, before bones were cataloged and measured, before humanity tried to define itself with scientific borders, there were stories. Not myths in the modern sense, not fairy tales meant to entertain, but records etched into clay by people who believed they were preserving memory. Among the most unsettling of these records are Sumerian texts that speak of beings who did not arrive from the sky, did not rule as gods, but simply walked beside humans. Not above, not below, beside. The phrasing is subtle, almost easy to miss if you are not looking for it. The texts do not describe monsters or spirits. They describe others who shared land, labor, and time. Beings who ate, worked, and lived in proximity to humans, yet were never fully described as human themselves. In several tablets, the wording distinguishes between the people and those who walked alongside the people. The separation is linguistic, deliberate, and consistent. Mainstream interpretations often blur these distinctions, translating everything as gods, demigods, or symbolic forces. But early Sumerian language was precise in its hierarchy. Gods were gods, humans were humans, servants were servants. When a different category appears, it matters, especially when it appears repeatedly across unrelated texts. Some passages describe early cities being built not only by humans, but with the help of others who possessed different strengths and different knowledge. These beings are not credited with divine creation powers. Instead, they are described as skilled in ways humans were not. Better at measuring land, better at working stone, better at enduring harsh conditions. The language suggests practical difference, not supernatural dominance. One tablet refers to those who knew the deep rhythms of the earth, a phrase often translated poetically, but which may have had a literal meaning. Another describes beings who heard what humans could not, a line usually interpreted as spiritual insight. But in the context of physical remains with unusual skull cavities and altered bone chemistry, the line takes on a different weight. What if this was not metaphor at all? What if it described a sensory difference? The Sumerians were not speculative philosophers. They were record keepers. They tracked grain, labor, trade, and lineage with obsessive detail. When they separated groups linguistically, it was because those groups existed in reality. Myth crept in later, when memory outlived context. Over generations, practical descriptions hardened into symbolic stories. There are also references to intermingling. Not marriage in the romantic sense, but union, mixing. Children born who were described as belonging to both worlds, yet fully accepted by neither. These passages are often glossed over or reinterpreted as royal bloodlines or priestly metaphors. But the wording does not suggest status. It suggests difference at birth. One fragment speaks of offspring who carried the weight of both forms, an odd phrase that does not align neatly with known social classes. Another describes individuals who were strong but short-lived, or perceptive but fragile. These are not compliments. They read like observations, like notes written by people trying to understand why some children were different. What is striking is what the texts do not say. They do not describe fear. They do not describe worship. They do not describe war against these beings. Instead, they describe coexistence that slowly fades. Later tablets reference a time before the separation, implying that at some point these others were no longer present. No great catastrophe is described, no divine punishment, just absence. That absence mirrors the archaeological record in an uncomfortable way. We know now that multiple human species disappeared without clear extinction events. Some faded through absorption, some through competition, some through environmental change. The Sumerian texts may not describe their disappearance because it was not dramatic. It was gradual, a quiet thinning of difference until only one form remained dominant. Modern scholars often argue that ancient people projected symbolic meaning onto their world because they lacked scientific understanding. But this assumes that modern categories are inherently superior. Ancient observers did not have microscopes or DNA sequencing, but they had something else: proximity. They lived next to what they described. They observed daily patterns. They noticed who aged differently, who healed differently, who sensed differently. If a parallel human species lived alongside early civilizations, ancient people would not have called them a species. They would have called them neighbors, workers, others. Only later, when they were gone, would memory drift into myth. The most unsettling line appears in a damaged tablet, translated loosely as, "When the walkers faded, the world grew quieter." This has been interpreted spiritually as a loss of divine connection. But consider another interpretation: a world where certain perceptions vanished, where certain sensitivities were no longer present in the population, where humanity became more uniform, more limited, more alone. The texts never say humans won. They never say humans were chosen. They simply imply that something ended, and that afterward, humans were on their own. If we place these texts alongside the physical anomalies found in museums, a pattern begins to emerge. Bones that do not match our biology, skulls that suggest different neural structures, mineral traces that imply altered biochemistry, and written records that describe others who were close enough to be mistaken for us, yet different enough to be named separately. History prefers clean stories: one species, one path, one origin. But reality rarely cooperates. The Sumerian texts may be among the oldest warnings that humanity was never singular, and that what we call human is the result of survival, not exclusivity. And if ancient people remembered walking beside others, then the bones in our museums may not be misidentified curiosities at all. They may be the last physical proof of neighbors we outlived, whose existence still echoes faintly in clay tablets, in bone chemistry, and in the quiet gaps of our own evolutionary story. Across continents and across centuries, there is a strange repetition in human storytelling that refuses to disappear. Different cultures, separated by oceans and time, describe groups of beings who lived close to humans yet remained apart. They were not enemies. They were not rulers. They were not spirits. They were simply there, watching, listening, rarely speaking. These stories call them by many names, but the pattern is consistent: silent tribes, people who lived underground, deep in forests, inside mountains, or beneath the earth's skin, always near, never fully seen. What makes these legends unsettling is not their supernatural tone, but their restraint. These beings are rarely described as magical. They do not cast spells or breathe fire. Instead, they are described as quiet, observant, and physically real. They leave footprints, they harvest food, they build shelters, they trade occasionally, often silently, leaving goods behind without words. In many stories, humans only realize they were being watched long after the watchers are gone. In parts of Europe, ancient folklore speaks of people who lived beneath hills and barrows, not as ghosts, but as neighbors who avoided direct contact. Farmers reported tools moved overnight, food stores rearranged, paths altered subtly, as if someone else was using the land differently. These beings were said to dislike noise, avoid crowds, and disappear when approached directly. The word silent appears again and again, not as a curse, but as a defining trait. In South American traditions, especially among Amazonian tribes, there are stories of forest people who live just beyond perception. They are described as human-like, but smaller, leaner, and far more aware of their surroundings. They do not speak aloud, but communicate through gestures or eye contact. Hunters believed these beings could sense intent before movement, avoiding danger long before it arrived. Importantly, they were not described as animals or spirits, but as people who chose not to engage. In parts of Asia, legends speak of underground dwellers who retreated beneath the earth during times of upheaval. These were not tales of hiding from monsters, but from humans themselves. The stories describe a time when the surface world grew loud, violent, and chaotic. Those who could not tolerate it went below. They dug, adapted, and vanished from daily interaction. Generations later, only whispers remained. What ties these stories together is the lack of drama around disappearance. These tribes are not destroyed. They fade. They withdraw. They choose absence over confrontation. That detail matters. Myths born from fear tend to exaggerate violence. Myths born from memory tend to soften loss. Anthropologists often interpret these stories as symbolic representations of isolation, fear of the unknown, or psychological projections. But symbolism does not explain the consistency of physical detail. The legends describe body types, behaviors, habitats, and limitations. They describe dietary habits, sleeping patterns, reactions to sound and light. These are observations, not metaphors. Many of these silent tribes are described as having heightened senses, exceptional hearing, acute awareness of vibration, sensitivity to sound that made human settlements unbearable. Drums, shouting, metalworking, and large gatherings were said to drive them away. In several legends, humans are warned not to shout near certain hills or forests, not out of superstition, but out of respect, as if noise itself was harmful to those who lived there. Now, place this beside physical evidence, skulls with additional cavities suggesting altered sensory processing, bones with unusual mineral compositions implying different metabolic tolerances. Suddenly the legends stop sounding imaginary and start sounding descriptive. A group with heightened sensory input would avoid noise. A group with different biochemistry might prefer environments humans find uncomfortable. Underground spaces offer stable temperatures, reduced sound, and controlled exposure to elements. Dense forests dampen noise and vibration. These are not mystical choices. They are practical adaptations. In several African traditions, there are stories of first people who did not speak as modern humans do. Communication was described as subtle, minimal, almost internal. Words were unnecessary. These beings were said to observe more than they acted. When humans arrived in greater numbers, louder and more aggressive, the silent ones withdrew, not because they were weaker, but because they were incompatible. Compatibility is rarely discussed in evolutionary storytelling, but it matters. Two species can share space only if their needs align. If one species thrives on noise, expansion, and dominance, and another thrives on quiet, sensitivity, and restraint, coexistence becomes temporary. One does not need to kill the other. It only needs to grow louder. There are also recurring warnings embedded in these legends. Humans are told not to dig too deep, not to disturb certain caverns, not to cut forests in specific regions. These warnings are often dismissed as superstition, but consider another possibility. They were boundaries, not sacred ones, but practical ones, lines drawn to prevent intrusion into habitats of others. In some traditions, children are warned that if they shout in certain places, the silent ones will leave forever. Not attack, not punish, leave. The threat is absence, not violence. That is a strange thing to invent unless it had already happened. The most disturbing detail appears in legends that say the silent tribes once helped humans, not as teachers or rulers, but as stabilizers. They knew weather patterns, animal movements, subtle changes in the land. When they vanished, humans lost something intangible. The world became harder to read, more unpredictable, more dangerous. Again, this is not framed as divine punishment, but as consequence. Modern humans rely heavily on external tools to sense the world. Instruments, machines, sensors. Ancient humans relied on perception. If another human-like group existed with superior sensory integration, their disappearance would not leave ruins. It would leave a gap in awareness, a quiet loss that only memory could preserve. There is also an uncomfortable overlap between these legends and reports of unidentified hominin groups encountered in recent history. Explorers, colonial records, and even early anthropologists occasionally described encounters with people who avoided speech, avoided eye contact, and disappeared into terrain with impossible ease. These reports were often dismissed or quietly buried because they did not fit racial or cultural frameworks. But they exist. What if these were not isolated tribes in the social sense, but biological outliers, remnants of a population that once coexisted widely, now reduced to pockets, then whispers, then stories? The underground legends may not describe fantasy realms. They may describe refuges, the last places where a different kind of human could survive without interference. Extinction does not always look like violence. Sometimes it looks like retreat, like silence, like choosing to vanish rather than adapt to a world that no longer suits you. And that brings us back to museums, to bones that don't quite match us, to chemistry that doesn't align, to skulls that suggest different ways of sensing reality. Physical remnants on one side, cultural memory on the other, both pointing toward the same unsettling idea: that humanity was once plural, that we did not evolve alone, that some of those who walked beside us did not die in battle or disaster, but simply stepped away into forests, into earth, into silence, and that what we call myth may be the last echo of neighbors we outgrew, not because we were better, but because we were louder. In modern science, DNA is treated as the final authority. Bone can lie, artifacts can be misdated, stories can distort. But DNA is supposed to be definitive. A sequence either matches known life, or it does not. That is why some of the quietest moments in laboratories are also the most disturbing. Because every so often, genetic testing does not return a result. It returns a question. There are documented cases where ancient DNA analysis was stopped, paused, or quietly abandoned because the sequences being recovered did not align with any known reference. Not human, not animal, not microbial contamination. Something else. The official explanations are cautious: degradation, noise, technical error. But these explanations do not always hold up under scrutiny. Ancient DNA work is difficult, but it follows patterns. Even heavily degraded samples usually show recognizable fragments, human mitochondrial markers, primate overlaps, familiar genetic motifs. But in certain specimens, researchers encountered sequences that could not be mapped onto any existing genetic database. The software did not fail. The extraction protocols were sound. The problem was that the DNA did not belong where it was expected to belong. In a few cases, labs reported unusually long stretches of genetic code that appeared structured, not random, yet did not correspond to any known species. These sequences were not short glitches. They were organized, repeating in ways that suggested function, not decay. When retested, the same fragments appeared again, ruling out one-time contamination. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable. Scientific institutions are built on reproducibility and classification. An unclassifiable result is not a discovery, it is a liability. Publishing such data invites skepticism, ridicule, and professional risk. So, instead of headlines, these findings often end in footnotes, internal memos, or silent termination of projects. Some geneticists have admitted off-record that there are samples they do not know how to categorize, not because they are alien, but because they fall outside the current model of human variation. Too different to be modern human, too similar to be dismissed as non-human, sitting in a genetic gray zone that science is not prepared to name. One common public explanation is contamination. Modern DNA entering ancient samples, but contamination leaves fingerprints. Modern sequences are easy to identify. They match known genomes almost immediately. The unidentifiable sequences did not match modern humans, lab animals, bacteria, or fungi. They matched nothing. Another explanation is degradation, creating artificial sequences, but degraded DNA breaks down chaotically. It does not form long, coherent stretches with internal logic. The sequences in question showed structure, patterns, repetition, as if they once encoded something meaningful. In at least one case, a research team attempted to isolate these sequences further, only to discover that standard primers did not bind as expected. The DNA behaved differently. Not impossibly, but unexpectedly. As if its molecular assumptions were slightly off from what modern biology is built around. This raises a deeply unsettling possibility. What if these bones did not belong to Homo sapiens at all, but to a closely related species whose genetic architecture diverged just enough to fall outside our reference systems? Our databases are built around known life. They cannot identify what they were never trained to recognize. Human evolution is now known to involve interbreeding with other hominins, Neanderthals, Denisovans, ghost populations inferred from genetic shadows. Every time one of these was discovered, it rewrote our understanding of who we are. Each time, the idea was initially resisted. DNA forced acceptance only when the data became overwhelming. But what happens when DNA itself refuses to cooperate? There is a quiet fear in genetics that not all lineages left descendants. Some may have gone extinct without merging into us. Their DNA would not appear in modern populations. Without a reference, their sequences would appear as anomalies, not ancestors. Science is good at tracing what survived. It struggles with what vanished completely. If a parallel human species existed, one that coexisted with us but did not significantly interbreed, their genetic legacy would be isolated in ancient remains. And when tested today, it would look wrong. Not monstrous, not alien. Just wrong enough to break expectations. Some halted projects were officially attributed to funding issues or sample preservation problems. But timing matters. In several instances, funding was pulled shortly after preliminary results suggested unexpected genetic divergence, not because the data was useless, but because it was too difficult to contextualize responsibly. There is also the issue of ethics. If DNA tests reveal a previously unknown human species, what obligations follow? How should remains be classified? How should museums label them? How should history be rewritten? These are not purely scientific questions. They are cultural, political, and philosophical, and institutions are rarely eager to open doors they cannot easily close. The language used in internal reports is revealing. Phrases like non-conforming sequences, unresolved genetic material, and anomalous fragments appear again and again. These are not words of dismissal. They are words of uncertainty, of restraint. Some geneticists have noted that the unknown sequences often appear in regions associated with neural development, sensory processing, or regulatory functions rather than basic metabolism. If true, this would align disturbingly well with physical evidence suggesting altered perception, different sensory integration, and alternative neurological architecture. It would also align with ancient descriptions of others who perceived the world differently, who sensed things humans could not, who lived quietly, attentively, and withdrew when the world grew incompatible. DNA does not encode behavior directly, but it sets the stage. Small differences in regulatory genes can produce profound changes in cognition, perception, and tolerance. A slight shift in how neurons fire, in how stimuli are processed, in how stress is handled, over thousands of years, that can produce a being who looks human, lives near humans, yet experiences reality in a fundamentally different way. The most disturbing aspect is not that these sequences exist, but that their investigation stops. Science advances by confronting anomalies, not avoiding them. Yet here, avoidance appears again and again. Not loudly, quietly, politely, with paperwork and closed doors. Publicly, we are told that human DNA is well understood, that our genome has been mapped, that the mystery is largely solved. But privately, researchers know this is not true. The genome is vast. Regulatory regions remain poorly understood. Ancient DNA introduces variables we are only beginning to grasp. If a forgotten human species left behind bones, tools, stories, and genetic traces, their final defense against erasure would be complexity. A genome just different enough to resist easy classification. A biology that refuses to fit neatly into our categories. And so, the tests halt. The samples return to storage. The sequences remain unnamed. Not because they are meaningless, but because naming them would force us to admit that humanity's story is not complete, that we were not alone, that some of those who walked beside us left traces even our most powerful tools struggle to interpret, and that in the silence of halted experiments, there may be answers waiting, not for better technology, but for better courage. There is a moment in the life of every museum exhibit that most visitors never see. It is not the moment of discovery, nor the moment it is placed under glass. It is the moment it disappears. No announcement, no plaque explaining a revision, no press release correcting a misunderstanding. One day the object is there, the next day it isn't. And if you ask, you're told it was moved, rotated, reclassified, or sent for conservation. A perfectly ordinary answer that hides a far less ordinary pattern. Over the past 2 decades, as museum archives slowly became visible online, something unexpected began to happen. Independent researchers, students, and curious observers started comparing old exhibition photographs with current displays. They noticed bones that were once prominently shown, now missing. Skulls with unusual openings, skeletons labeled ambiguously, remains that sparked comment threads, forum discussions, and quiet speculation. And almost without exception, when attention grew loud enough, those bones vanished from public view. This was not the dramatic removal of a controversial artwork. It was subtler. A skull replaced with a cast, a skeleton repositioned so that certain features were no longer visible, an entire display quietly dismantled and never rebuilt. The official reasons varied: renovation, updated interpretation, space constraints, but the timing was often too precise to ignore. Online discussion would spike, screenshots would circulate, questions would be asked, then the object would be gone. Museums are careful institutions. They understand optics. They also understand risk. When a display invites questions that cannot be easily answered, the safest response is silence. Not denial, not confrontation, absence. In several well-documented cases, bones that had attracted attention for anatomical anomalies were removed shortly after being discussed publicly. Visitors who returned months later found only empty cases or entirely new narratives. When asked, staff members often gave polite but vague explanations. The remains were under review. The classification was being updated. Further study was required. The same phrases appear again and again across different institutions and different countries. What makes this unsettling is not that museums update exhibits. That is normal. What is unsettling is that these updates consistently move anomalous bones out of sight, not into clearer explanation. If the bones were misinterpreted, one would expect correction, new signage, educational clarification. Instead, the bones simply stop being visible. In the digital age, nothing truly disappears. Archived photographs remain. Old guidebooks exist. Academic catalogs list items no longer on display. In some cases, the catalog numbers remain active, but the physical objects are no longer accessible even to visiting researchers without special permission. They are not destroyed. They are withdrawn. This behavior suggests discomfort, not error. Institutions do not hide mistakes. They hide uncertainties that threaten foundational narratives. A mislabeled artifact is easy to fix. An artifact that raises questions about human identity is not. Online attention changes the equation. Inside academic circles, anomalies can be managed quietly, debated, deferred. But once the public begins to notice patterns, once non-specialists start asking the wrong questions, control becomes more difficult. Museums are not just research spaces. They are cultural authorities. They tell stories about who we are and where we come from. Anything that destabilizes that story must be handled carefully. And so, the bones are removed. Sometimes they are replaced with replicas that smooth over difference. Sometimes they are recontextualized as ritual objects or pathological examples, without addressing why those explanations were not offered before. Sometimes they are simply gone, leaving behind a gap where curiosity once lived. There is also a psychological component at play. Museums rely on trust. Visitors assume that what they see has been vetted, classified, and understood. Allowing visibly anomalous human remains to sit unexplained under glass invites doubt. If one bone does not fit the story, what else might not fit? Doubt spreads faster than facts. In internal communications that have surfaced over the years, museum staff sometimes describe concern about misinterpretation or speculative narratives. These phrases are revealing. They do not say the interpretation is wrong, they say it is uncontrolled. The fear is not error, it is loss of narrative authority. Consider how often the phrase "taken down due to public misunderstanding" appears in cultural institutions. It assumes that understanding flows in one direction only, that the public cannot ask valid questions, that curiosity must be guided, or it becomes dangerous. but curiosity is often how science advances. The removal of these bones mirrors earlier moments in scientific history. Fossils ignored because they did not fit evolutionary models. Artifacts dismissed because they complicated timelines. Data sidelined because it raised questions no one was ready to answer. In every case, the pattern is the same. Anomaly appears, attention grows, authority retreats. What is rarely acknowledged is that removal does not erase awareness. It amplifies it. People notice absence more sharply than presence. When something vanishes without explanation, it invites speculation far more than a transparent admission of uncertainty ever would. The bones themselves do not change when they are removed. Their cavities remain. Their mineral signatures remain. Their DNA remains unresolved. Only our access changes. Only our permission to look is revoked. And that may be the most telling detail of all. If these bones were truly unremarkable, they would not need to be hidden. If they were conclusively explained, they could be displayed confidently, even controversially. Museums display difficult truths all the time. Violence, death, extinction. What they struggle to display is uncertainty about humanity itself. Removing the bones from public view does not make the questions go away. It simply shifts them into darker spaces. Online archives, private discussions, independent research. And history shows that questions pushed into the shadows do not disappear. They accumulate pressure. Every time a bone is quietly removed after drawing attention, it sends an unspoken message. There is something here we are not ready to talk about. And that raises a final, deeply unsettling thought. If the story of humanity were complete, if our origins were fully understood, if every bone fit neatly into place, there would be nothing to hide. The fact that these bones vanish when noticed suggests that the danger is not in what they are. The danger is in what they imply. That the line between human and other was once thinner than we are comfortable admitting. That museums may hold evidence not just of our past, but of neighbors we outlived. And that sometimes, silence is not the absence of truth. It is the sound of truth being carefully moved out of sight. Hunters and hikers rarely speak publicly about what they experience deep in remote terrain. Not because nothing happens, but because what happens is difficult to frame without sounding unstable. These are people accustomed to isolation, silence, and danger. They know the difference between fear and imagination. That is what makes a certain category of reports so unsettling. Reports of tall, silent humanoid figures that do not behave like animals, do not behave like people, and yet move through the wilderness with an ease no modern human possesses. These encounters are strikingly consistent across geography. Dense forests, mountain ranges, remote valleys, places where sound behaves differently, where visibility collapses into layers of shadow and depth. Witnesses often describe the same sequence of events, a sudden feeling of being watched, an unnatural quiet, no birds, no insects, then movement, upright, controlled, deliberate, not rushing, not hiding, simply present. The figures are usually described as taller than average humans, but not exaggeratedly so. Broad-shouldered, elongated, proportioned differently. Not monstrous, not deformed, just subtly wrong. Their movements are smooth, economical, almost silent, even on terrain where noise would be unavoidable. Leaves do not crunch, branches do not snap. It is as if they understand the land at a level modern humans have lost. What stands out most is the lack of aggression. These figures do not chase. They do not threaten. They do not approach closely. They observe. They stand at the edge of perception. And when noticed directly, they leave. Not in panic. Not hurried. They simply withdraw into terrain that should not conceal something that large, yet somehow does. Hunters often report that animals behave strangely before these encounters. Dogs freeze or refuse to move. Horses become agitated without visible cause. Wildlife disappears. This suggests not imagination, but a disruption in the environmental baseline. Something has entered the space that other animals recognize as significant. Skeptics often reach for familiar explanations. Bears standing upright, misidentified hikers, optical illusions. But these explanations fail when details are examined closely. Bears do not move with controlled balance for extended periods. They do not observe from a distance and then retreat quietly. Other hikers make noise, leave tracks, wear gear. These figures leave almost nothing behind. In several reports, witnesses describe brief moments of eye contact. Not glowing eyes, not supernatural features, just eyes that feel alert, aware, and intensely focused. The feeling is not fear in the traditional sense, it is recognition, as if both parties understand they are seeing something unexpected, and neither wants to escalate the encounter. This is where the reports become psychologically unsettling. Witnesses often say they felt they were not supposed to see these beings, that the encounter was accidental, a crossing of paths that should not have intersected. This feeling persists even among rational observers who reject supernatural explanations. Anthropologists studying oral traditions have noted a disturbing overlap. Many indigenous cultures describe forest dwellers who avoid direct contact, communicate minimally, and retreat deeper into the land as human presence expands. These are not spirits. They are described as physical beings with rules, boundaries, habits. Modern hikers, unknowingly retracing ancient roots, may be entering territories that once supported different forms of human life. If a parallel human lineage survived longer in isolated regions, adapting to silence, camouflage, and restraint, it would leave exactly this kind of trace: rare encounters, minimal interaction, withdrawal instead of confrontation. Silence is key. These beings are almost always described as quiet, not just mute, but acoustically invisible. This aligns disturbingly well with physical evidence suggesting altered sensory processing and sensitivity to sound. A being overwhelmed by noise would evolve to avoid it completely. Forests and mountains absorb sound. Underground spaces dampen it. Civilization amplifies it. Some witnesses report that the figures seem to anticipate movement, turning their heads before the observer shifts position, changing direction before being approached. This suggests heightened situational awareness, not magic. Enhanced perception does not require supernatural explanation. It requires biology tuned differently. There is also a notable absence of technology. No tools, no clothing in the modern sense. This has led many to dismiss the encounters as folklore. But technology is not a universal marker of intelligence. It is a cultural choice. A species adapted to minimal environmental disruption would avoid leaving traces. Tools break. Fire scars. Structures announce presence. Silence preserves survival. The most unsettling detail appears in reports where multiple people witness the same figure independently. Separate observers describing the same posture, same height, same movement pattern. Hallucinations do not synchronize. Imagination does not coordinate. Authorities rarely investigate these reports seriously. They are logged, ignored, or reclassified as misidentification. But patterns persist. They always do. If these beings exist, they do not behave like animals hiding from predators. They behave like neighbors avoiding conflict. Like remnants of something that understands it no longer belongs in the dominant world. Extinction does not always mean death. Sometimes it means retreat, withdrawal, becoming invisible by choice rather than force. If a forgotten human species survived longer than we assume, adapting to silence and distance, they would not build cities. They would not leave monuments. They would leave only fleeting encounters, glimpses, stories told quietly, reluctantly, by people who know what they saw but cannot explain it. And perhaps that is why these reports feel so disturbing. Not because they suggest monsters in the woods, but because they suggest that the line between us and them may not be as clear as we believe, that some who walked beside us may still walk the edges of our world, watching, waiting, silent. Across the oldest layers of human memory, there is a recurring name that appears with unsettling consistency. They are not always described the same way, but they are always recognized as older. Older than villages, older than kings, older than the stories themselves. Ancient folklore calls them the Watchers, the first people, those who were here before names. And in nearly every tradition, they are described not as creators of humanity, but as witnesses to it. What is striking is how restrained these descriptions are. The Watchers are rarely worshipped. They are not begged for miracles. They are not blamed for disasters. Instead, they are acknowledged, not as gods, but as presences, beings who observe, remember, and endure. This is not the language of religion, it is the language of coexistence. In many traditions, the first people are said to have arrived before the world became loud, before fire spread widely, before the land was reshaped by farming and expansion. They are described as quiet, patient, and deeply aware of cycles humans barely noticed, seasons within seasons, changes in animal behavior, subtle shifts in wind, water, and stone. These are not supernatural powers. They are attentions refined over generations. One of the most unsettling details appears again and again. The Watchers do not intervene. They do not guide humanity toward progress. They do not stop wars or prevent collapse. They simply observe. In some stories, this is framed as wisdom. In others, as sadness. But the core idea remains the same. They are not responsible for us. They are witnesses, not parents. In several ancient traditions, the first people are described as taller, leaner, and longer lived, but not immortal. Their bodies are said to be strong but fragile in unexpected ways, sensitive to sound, sensitive to disruption, sensitive to imbalance. This sensitivity is not portrayed as weakness, it is portrayed as cost. Awareness always comes with a price. Children are warned not to mock the Watchers, not because they will retaliate, but because disrespect breaks something unseen. Not a rule, a balance. In these stories, when humans grow too numerous, too noisy, too careless, the Watchers do not fight, they leave. And the land changes afterward. Rivers behave differently. Animals migrate strangely. Storms become harder to predict. Again, these are not punishments. They are consequences of absence. The phrase first people itself is revealing. It does not imply superiority. It implies chronology, presence before dominance. In some languages, the term used does not even translate cleanly as people, but as those who stand, those who remain still while the world moves around them, those who watch. This watching is not passive. It is described as attentive, deliberate, and continuous. The Watchers are said to remember things humans forget, paths that no longer exist, agreements no longer honored, places that must not be disturbed. In this sense, they function as living archives, not of law, but of land. What makes these stories deeply unsettling is how often they describe an ending. Not an apocalypse, not a battle, a thinning, a withdrawal, a moment when the Watchers are no longer seen at the edges of camps, when their silent presence fades into memory. The language used is often mournful, not triumphant. Humanity does not celebrate being alone. It notices it too late. In some traditions, elders say that humans were once watched to see what kind of beings they would become, not judged morally, but observed practically. Would they listen? Would they notice limits? Would they share space? When humans failed these unspoken tests, the Watchers did not punish them. They stopped watching. That detail matters. To stop watching is to disengage, to abandon responsibility, to accept separation. Across continents, folklore insists on one thing. The Watchers did not disappear because they were destroyed. They disappeared because they no longer belonged. Their way of being was incompatible with what humanity was becoming. Expansion over attunement, noise over attention, ownership over coexistence. This idea aligns disturbingly well with the physical evidence left behind. Bones that suggest different sensory processing. Skulls that imply alternative neural architecture. Mineral signatures that point to a body tuned to conditions humans find hostile. These are not traits optimized for conquest. They are traits optimized for perception. If the Watchers were real biological beings, not spirits or metaphors, their survival strategy would not involve dominance. It would involve avoidance, silence, distance, observation without interference. That is exactly how they are described. There are also traditions that say a few Watchers remain, not as rulers or teachers, but as reminders, living far from human centers, avoiding attention, choosing invisibility over extinction. These stories are often told quietly, not to scare children, but to teach restraint, to remind humans that not everything unseen is gone. Modern people tend to dismiss these stories because they do not fit into categories of myth or history. They sit in between. too grounded to be fantasy, too strange to be comfortable fact. But that in-between space is where memory often hides when truth becomes inconvenient. The Watchers are rarely named because names imply ownership. To name something is to claim it. These beings are not claimed. They are acknowledged. That distinction is important. It suggests that ancient people recognized limits to their authority. There were others who shared the world, and they were not ours to command. When folklore speaks of the first people, it does not mean the first humans. It means the first ones who stood in relation to the land the way the land required. Humans came later with different needs, different priorities, different noise. If we accept that multiple human-like species once coexisted, then folklore becomes less symbolic and more historical. The Watchers may not have been supernatural guardians. They may have been a parallel lineage whose defining trait was awareness rather than ambition. And if that is true, then the sadness embedded in these stories makes sense, because the disappearance of the Watchers would not feel like victory. It would feel like loss, a quiet one. The loss of being observed by something that understood the world more deeply than we ever did. Perhaps that is why the idea persists. Not because it frightens us, but because it unsettles us. It suggests that humanity was once seen, not judged, seen, and that whatever was watching eventually turned away, not in anger, but in silence. And if bones, genetics, and living encounters all hint at remnants of such beings, then ancient folklore may not be telling us about imaginary watchers at all. It may be remembering neighbors, the first people, those who walked beside us, and chose in the end to stop watching. Around the world, something quiet has been happening beneath our feet, not loudly announced, not framed as a single policy, but visible if you pay attention long enough. Caves are closing, access is tightening, permits are harder to obtain. Entire underground systems that were once explored freely are now restricted, sealed, or placed under vague environmental protection rules that go far beyond preservation. On the surface, the explanations seem reasonable. Safety concerns, fragile ecosystems, liability, protection of bats, cultural heritage. Each reason makes sense on its own. But when you step back and look globally, a pattern emerges that is difficult to ignore. Restrictions are increasing even in caves, with no tourism, no endangered species, and no history of accidents. Places that were barely known are suddenly off limits. Remote systems that pose no public risk are reclassified as sensitive zones. Caves are one of the last environments on Earth that remain poorly understood. Satellites cannot see into them. Drones cannot easily map them. Ground-penetrating radar struggles with depth and density. What lies beneath remains largely unknown unless someone physically enters and documents it. And increasingly, that physical entry is being discouraged, delayed, or outright forbidden. Official language around these closures is revealing. Terms like unregulated exploration, uncontrolled discovery, and unauthorized documentation appear frequently. These are not words of environmental care. They are words of control. They imply that discovery itself is the problem, not damage. In several countries, new laws restrict not only entry, but publication. Independent explorers are warned against sharing maps, photographs, or coordinates. Research must pass through approved institutions. Data must be reviewed. Findings must be contextualized before release. This is not how science traditionally accelerates. This is how it slows, funnels, and filters. Caves matter because they preserve what the surface erases. They are time capsules. Bones survive there when they decay elsewhere. Footprints fossilize. Art remains untouched by weather. DNA persists longer. If a parallel human lineage survived longer underground or retreated there during periods of surface upheaval, caves would be the last places their traces remain intact. This is not speculation pulled from fiction. Archaeology already knows this. Some of the most important human discoveries of the last century came from caves, entire species redefined by a handful of bones preserved underground. Each time, the story of humanity changed. Each time, resistance followed. Now, imagine what would happen if something appeared that did not fit at all, not a variation, not a cousin we can neatly name, but evidence of a group that lived alongside us far longer than expected, perhaps even into historical times. Evidence that bridges folklore, anatomy, and modern encounters. Evidence that raises questions not just about evolution, but about coexistence. Caves are also where silence dominates. Sound behaves differently. Light disappears quickly. Sensory thresholds change. A being adapted to heightened perception would thrive underground. Humans do not. We are clumsy there, loud, disruptive, temporary. The underground favors those who move quietly, who sense vibration, who understand darkness as environment rather than absence. There are documented cases where cave expeditions were halted mid-project after unexpected finds, not always publicly described. Funding redirected. Access reclassified. Reports sealed or delayed indefinitely. The public explanation is often further study required, but further study rarely happens openly. Governments do not restrict access without reason. Bureaucracy is slow, reactive, and expensive. To change policy across multiple regions requires pressure, risk, incentive. When similar restrictions appear independently across the world, it suggests shared concerns, not coincidence. Some officials cite cultural sensitivity without specifying which culture. Others cite national heritage without explaining why heritage requires secrecy. Heritage is usually displayed, celebrated, taught. It is not hidden unless it complicates identity. Caves are not just holes in the ground. They are boundaries between surface and depth, between known and unknown, between what is easily controlled and what resists oversight. Closing them reduces uncertainty. It also reduces the chance of uncontrolled discovery. This is not about treasure or danger. It is about narrative. Who gets to define the past? Who gets to decide which discoveries are meaningful and which are misinterpretations? Once something is found underground, it cannot be unfound. The only remaining control is timing and framing. Environmental protection is real and important, but it has also become a convenient umbrella under which many unrelated restrictions can gather. When protection is the true motive, transparency usually increases. When protection is a cover, transparency decreases. The deeper concern is not that caves are closing, it is that curiosity is being managed, that independent observation is being replaced by approved interpretation, that the last uncontrolled archive of deep human history is becoming inaccessible to anyone outside narrow channels. If the story of humanity were complete, caves would pose no threat. They would only confirm what we already know. The urgency to restrict suggests the opposite, that there are still answers underground that do not fit comfortably above ground. And if remnants of those who walked beside us retreated into silence, into depth, into darkness, then caves are not just geological features. They are refuges, final ones. Restricting access does not erase what is there. It only delays who finds it, how it is explained, and whether the public ever sees it unfiltered. History shows that when access narrows, curiosity does not die. It sharpens. Because when the world above grows loud and controlled, the truth has always waited below, in silence, in stone, in places we are increasingly told not to look. What if the most uncomfortable truth is not that humans evolved alongside others, but that we arrived late, not as the first minds to stand upright on this planet, not as the original observers of the world, but as the second wave, the inheritors, the survivors who mistake survival for primacy. Modern human history is built on an unspoken assumption. That intelligence culminated with us. That before Homo sapiens, there were attempts, drafts, imperfect versions slowly leading to our arrival. But evolution does not work toward a goal. It works through chance, pressure, and compromise. The species that remains is not the best. It is the one that fits the moment. If another human-like species existed before us, truly before us, not as a branching cousin, but as a dominant presence, then everything shifts. We stop being the origin story and become a sequel. And sequels rarely understand the worlds that came before them. Consider what first really means. Not first to exist, but first to define the rules of engagement with the planet. First to map subtle patterns. First to learn how to listen rather than impose. A species whose intelligence may not have expressed itself through expansion, monuments, or technology, but through perception, through restraint, through awareness of limits. Such a species would leave very little behind. No empires, no massive architecture, no scars on the landscape. Their success would be measured in balance, not dominance, and balance leaves fewer artifacts than conquest. Now, imagine humans arriving into that world, louder, faster, less perceptive but more aggressive, better at numbers, better at coordination for conflict, better at reshaping environments quickly. Evolution does not reward harmony when competition escalates. Biochemistry that implies a body tuned to conditions we find intolerable. DNA that refuses to be classified because our reference point assumes we are the baseline. If humans were second, then our story is not one of emergence, but of succession. This also reframes intelligence itself. We measure intelligence by tool-making, language dominance, abstraction, and control. But intelligence can manifest in other ways. Environmental attunement, predictive awareness, sensory integration, the ability to survive without altering the world aggressively. These forms of intelligence do not scale well. They do not build civilizations, but they can persist for immense spans of time. A first species might have been deeply local, tied to specific landscapes, dependent on subtle environmental cues, highly adapted, but not flexible. When the climate shifted, when new competitors arrived, when noise and disruption increased, they would not fight for dominance. They would retreat, adapt inward, or disappear. Humans, by contrast, are generalists. We tolerate disruption, we create it. We thrive in chaos we generate ourselves. That makes us exceptional survivors, but poor caretakers of quiet systems. If we were second, then many things we label as myth become memories. Not precise, but emotionally accurate. Stories of a time before humans ruled the land, of beings who knew it better, of a loss that was never framed as conquest, because conquest was not how it happened. We did not defeat them. We replaced them. Replacement is quieter than war. It leaves fewer graves, fewer weapons, fewer dramatic endings. It leaves absence, gradual thinning, retreat into margins, into forests, into mountains, into caves, into silence. It would also explain why modern encounters, if real, are fleeting, why nothing announces itself, why no claim is made, why there is no attempt to reassert presence. A first species that lost the surface world would not try to reclaim it from billions. It would do what it always did: observe, avoid, endure as long as possible. There is also a psychological discomfort here that runs deep. Humans define themselves as the reference point, the measure. To accept that we are second is to accept humility at a biological level, not chosen, not destined, just successful. And success, in evolutionary terms, does not mean right. If we were second, then the planet did not evolve toward us. We adapted to a planet already shaped by others, the quiet paths, the ancient warnings, the sacred places marked not for worship, but for avoidance. These may not have been superstition. They may have been inherited boundaries, boundaries we no longer recognize. This would also explain the strange tension between progress and loss that runs through human history. The feeling that something was traded away, that awareness narrowed as power increased, that the world became more manageable but less intelligible. We gained control but lost intimacy. A first species might have understood the planet as a system to be read, not owned. Humans read it too, but we also rewrite it, often blindly. If the first species still exists in fragments, then their silence is not weakness, it is strategy. Visibility invites domination. Attention invites destruction. The safest place for something incompatible with modern humanity is the edge of perception. And if they are gone entirely, then what remains are echoes, bones, stories, genetic fragments that do not quite fit, restrictions around places that preserve too much memory, a quiet discomfort whenever the idea arises that we were not alone first. The most unsettling implication is this: if we were second, then we inherited responsibility without understanding the original terms. We stepped into a world already balanced in ways we barely perceive, and we have been reshaping it ever since, without the sensitivity that once held it together. The watchers may not have been watching us to judge us. They may have been watching to see whether we would notice what they already knew. And if we were second, then the greatest tragedy is not that the first disappeared. It is that we never realized what we replaced. Not until their silence became the loudest thing left.